Hello everyone, my name is Kevin Hagopi and I teach here in the College of Communications, and I'd like to welcome you to this year's Robert M. Pockrass Memorial Lecture. Dr. Pockrass was a member of the Penn State journalism faculty from 1948 until 1977. His teaching specialties were radio news writing, public opinion, and popular culture, and he loved to travel. For these reasons, speakers from this lecture series are often notable experts in popular culture, public opinion, and international communication. Dr. Pockrass possibly was best known for his dedication to students, not only when they were enrolled here on campus, but after they left Penn State. For many years, in fact, he edited the school's alumni news, personally keeping in touch with hundreds of alumni. He once attributed his great ability to remember the names and faces of countless graduates to the fact that he had for years edited the alumni notes. But those close to him knew that it was really because he cared so much about students as human beings. The purpose of this lecture is to honor Dr. Pockrass's memory and his many contributions to the former School of Journalism. The lecture series was endowed through scores of gifts contributed in his honor, the most significant of which have been made recently by Judith Hardees of Phoenix, Arizona, a 1952 Penn State graduate with strong family ties to the institution. Her father, Anthony Luschek, was the founding director in 1947 of the Labor Education Program in Extension Services here at Penn State. Judith has been inducted into the Arizona Democratic Party Hall of Fame and is an astute observer of politics and a seasoned traveler. When Judith learned of the Pockrass Lecture, she contacted us, saying how much she had admired Bob Pockrass's commitment to and talent for teaching. When she finds something she believes in, she gets behind it, and we're very appreciative. On behalf of the Pockrass Coordination Committee, myself, Boaz DeVere, Joe Dumas, and our chair, Matt McAllister, we'd also like to thank others for making the Pockrass Lectureship possible, including Dean Marie Harden, Associate Dean Ford Risley, Joella Martin and Steve Samsel of the College of Communications, Anthony Olarona-Shola, the Department Head of Film, Video, and Media Studies, Cheryl McCallops of University Libraries, and Jeff Knapp, our Foster Communications Librarian. I'd now like to introduce Dunya Antonovich, a recent PhD alumna, who this fall will be a faculty member in the Charlie Steiner School of Sports Communication at Bradley University, and who in turn will introduce this year's Pockrass speaker. Dunya?
Good afternoon. It is my great pleasure to introduce and welcome today's Pockrass Memorial Lecture speaker, Dr. Travis Vogan. Dr. Vogan is assistant professor at the University of Iowa with a dual appointment in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication and the Department of American Studies. Both programs have, for decades, actually housed some of the leading sport media and sport studies scholars. Dr. Vogan holds a PhD from Indiana University's Communication and Culture program, and as his current appointment suggests, his research speaks to multiple scholarly communities and truly transcends interdisciplinary boundaries. Drawing connections between sport, media, and American culture, Dr. Vogan has published extensively on the cultural history and institutional identity of sport media outlets and content. His work has appeared in top peer-reviewed journals, including Journal of Sport History, which is a top journal in the field, International Journal of Sport Communication, Communication and Sport, Convergence, and Film and History. Last year, the University of Illinois Press published Dr. Vogan's first book, titled Keepers of the Flame, NFL Films, Pro Football, and the Rise of Sport Media in America. His book has already garnered much-deserved attention in the scholarly community. For instance, a reviewer for the International Journal of the History of Sport called Keepers of the Flame a, quote, excellent study, an iridescent work that strengthens our grasp of the intersection between sports, media, and business. I am thrilled, as I know you are, that Dr. Vogan accepted the invitation to speak at Penn State on ESPN Culture and to thereby strengthen our grasp of the complicated relationship between sport and media. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Travis Vogan.
Thanks for having me, I appreciate it. Thanks to the College of Communication, especially Kevin Hagopi, Matt McAllister, and Joella Martin for organizing this trip and inviting me. It's really an honor to be here, especially at a place like Penn State, which is such a landmark spot for folks who study sport and media. And I was really happy this afternoon at lunch when I was talking with some of the grad students to see that they've been interacting with the folks, the great folks in sport history or in kinesiology, and that they take each other's classes and that they know each other. And for someone who does interdisciplinary work, it's just a really great thing to see, because so often, you get in these little silos, and then you find out a few years later that somebody's doing something pretty similar to you a couple halls down, and it's nice to know that that's not happening here. So thanks so much. It's an honor to be speaking at a lecture named for Professor Pockrass, who, from the sound of it, was kind of an ideal academic. And so thanks a lot. And this talk is from a book I have in the pipeline called ESPN, The Making. Is this okay? We good? Yeah, we good? Okay, just checking. Called ESPN, The Making of a Sport Media Empire. I actually wanted to title the book ESPN Culture, but my publisher said that the word culture might alienate some popular readers. So I guess we're gonna wait until they start reading it to alienate them. And anyhow, but shortly after ESPN's, got a hot mic. Okay. Hello? All right. You ready? Oh, okay. Cool. All right, so shortly after ESPN's September 7th, 1979 launch, the Washington Post's Jane Levy asked the new outlet's president, Chet Simmons, how he thought the public would respond to an all-sports cable TV network. I guess we'll have to have a battery of divorce lawyers standing by to handle all the cases, Simmons quipped. Did you ever think that a television network would be named as a co-respondent in a divorce action? 3 years later, a woman in Austin, Texas, actually did name ESPN in her divorce suit. She claimed it ruined her marriage by offering her apparently addicted husband too much sports coverage. In 1998, ESPN set up a satellite receiver in Antarctica. The move transformed it into the only cable outlet servicing every continent on Earth. In the process, it made ESPN's self-given title as the worldwide leader in sports, also adopted in '98, seem slightly less audacious. As then ESPN chair Steve Bornstein remarked, "The sun never sets on the ESPN empire." On January 26, 2000, Alicia and Chad Blondeel of Newaygo, Michigan, named their newborn son Espen, a tribute to Chad's favorite TV channel. The name is now registered on babydames.com. In 2006, ESPN unveiled mobile ESPN, a cellular phone that also provided on-demand sports content anywhere its customers roamed. The gadget proved a spectacular failure and was off the market within a year. This costly experiment, however, illustrates ESPN's monumental ambition and even conceit. With mobile ESPN, the media outlet not only strove for ubiquity, but also attempted to serve as a branded circuit through which customers passed anytime they checked scores, ordered a pizza, or called a friend. "We wanted a total sports ecosystem," said ESPN Vice President Manish Jha of the eventually aborted project. So what could be more popular than ESPN? Not much, according to a 2014 Forbes report that named it the world's most valuable media property and second most valuable sports brand after Nike. ESPN is popular in two principal ways, both of which illuminate its significance and uses. First of all, it's pervasive. Second, it is utterly ordinary. Sports media, in part because of their ordinariness, are traditionally considered to be less thoughtful than other genres. Though the sports page is traditionally or long drug-driven newspaper sales, it is known throughout the industry as a toy department not held to the same journalistic standards as real news. This attitude is similar in sports television, which is often critiqued for claiming to report on the organizations that TV outlets pay for the rights to carry games. Moreover, the beer-guzzling, pot-bellied male sports television viewer has become a popular symbol of idle masculinity. In these representations, sports TV is an excuse to avoid thinking rather than a site that provokes thought. If culture, notes sport scholar David Rowe, is the frame through which we experience, interpret, mold, and represent everything that surrounds us, then sport occupies an uncommonly prominent position within it. By extension, if media, as Robert McChesney argues, made sport, then sport media play a key role in culture. No institution has had a more influential role in this popular milieu than ESPN. We blame our failed relationships on it, name our kids after it, and can access it anytime and anywhere, even Antarctica. If you go to an ESPN Zone restaurant and order enough ESPYs, a cocktail named after ESPN's annual award show, you can get drunk on ESPN. In short, we live in an ESPN culture. Raymond Williams cites culture as one of the English language's most complex terms. Most generally, it is a signifying system through which a social order is communicated, reproduced, and experienced. It is also the work and practices of intellectual and artistic activity, what 19th century poet and critic Matthew Arnold called the best that has been thought and said. Culture, in this second sense, composes the objects and undertakings that make us cultured. While sports media are arguably a part of culture, they are not stereotypically cultured. But over the course of its history, ESPN has strategically engaged practices considered more sophisticated than run-of-the-mill sports media, an effort that intensified after the Walt Disney Company's 1996 acquisition of ESPN and the cable network's resultant transformation into a synergy-driven, multi-platform sub-conglomerate. ESPN began to produce documentaries, publish books, create fictional series, curate film festivals, sponsor literary writing awards, employ Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists. These activities work to inflect this ESPN culture with culture. They simultaneously drive a shrewd effort to distinguish ESPN from other sports media outlets and to help it compete for market share, expand its demographic reach, promote content, and even cut costs. These practices compose an important strain in ESPN's institutional DNA that showcase how sports media's cultural status is built and illuminates the ends that inform this practice. Some of ESPN's most successful efforts to build prestige grew out of impressive blunders. In 2001, ESPN formed the subsidiary ESPN Original Entertainment, which produced a variety of reality programs, talk shows, docudramas, and scripted series. It principally engaged these new genres to expand ESPN's viewership beyond adult male sports fans. ESPN Hollywood was a tabloid-esque news program modeled after Entertainment Tonight and hosted by Mario Lopez. Beg, Borrow, and Deal aped MTV's Road Rules. And A Season on the Brink adapted John Feinstein's popular book of the same title into a made-for-TV movie starring Brian Dennehy. Though they extended the ESPN brand to unforeseen environs, EOE's productions were mostly panned. The website Sports Media Watch's 2009 list of the 10 worst programs of the decade included 8 of the subsidiary's productions. EOE, and they're actually pretty bad. EOE experimented with independently produced documentaries by acquiring John Hawk's Through the Fire in 2005, which premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival. It created additional buzz for the film by facilitating its continued exhibition on the festival circuit. The documentary earned the Audience Award at the AFI Film Fest and collected the Urban World Film Festival's Best Documentary Prize before premiering on ESPN in March 2006. Through the Fire's DVD packaging includes the logos from the film festivals where it appeared and describes the production as ESPN's critically acclaimed documentary, even though the media outlet was uninvolved in its production. ESPN's promotional campaign suggested it not simply acquired Through the Fire, but also the film's accolades and independent cachet. ESPN producer John Dahl describes the network's relationship to Through the Fire as a foreshadowing of what was to come. After the film's acquisition, EOE was folded into ESPN Films, which shifted focus to documentary, a genre to which ESPN had not devoted considerable resources since its Peabody Award-winning 1999 project, Sports Century. The following year, ESPN teamed with the Tribeca Film Festival to create the Tribeca ESPN Sports Film Festival. Film historian Thomas Elsasser describes festivals as, quote, the Olympics of the show business economy that allow independent films to gain exposure and offer corporate media outlets a chance to scout new material. Tribeca and ESPN's partnership, however unlikely, is mutually beneficial. Tribeca co-founder Jane Rosenthal claims that ESPN's brand recognition attracts new visitors to the festival and provides a useful programming function that signals to attendees which selections have sporting themes. Meanwhile, Tribeca brokers ESPN's entrance into a rarefied cultural space. "We want our brand to be in front of people who aren't sports fans," says ESPN Films' Dan Silver. While Tribeca maintains control over the selection process, the partnership provides ESPN with a pipeline to procuring productions that appear at the event and a respectable site where it can exhibit its own works. And ESPN expanded on its film festival with the Tribeca ESPN Sports Day, a family-friendly street fair composed mostly of promotional sports exhibits and activities. Though formed in Through the Fire and the Tribeca ESPN Film Festival's documentary-driven wake, ESPN Films initially strove to develop fictional films for theatrical release in partnership with Hollywood studios. The subsidiary began development on 2 biopics, one on Vince Lombardi starring Robert De Niro, and another on Jackie Robinson with Robert Redford attached as an actor and producer. The projects were shelved, however, after economic downturn tightened credit lines and made Hollywood studios less willing to invest in sports films, which typically attract small international audiences. Given these constraints, John Skipper, who ran ESPN Films before assuming ESPN's presidency in 2012, believed documentary would compose a more respectable and less expensive focal point for ESPN Films. Quote, "We're no longer in the movie business for television," Skipper announced. "We can make 10 documentaries for the same $5 million it would cost to make one movie." The subsidiary's first original production, Dan Flores' Black Magic, is a 4-hour exploration of race and basketball in the United States through the lens of historically black colleges and universities. Flores and ESPN advertised the documentary's relationship to African American culture by premiering it at Harlem's Apollo Theater. Moreover, Flores claimed Black Magic was inspired by Ken Burns' critically acclaimed 1994 documentary Baseball. ESPN emphasized the film's similarity to baseball by initially airing it without commercial interruption in prime time over the course of 2 evenings and marketing it as a Dan Flores film rather than simply an ESPN production. It was the first time ESPN adopted either practice. This careful cultivation of Black Magic as an authored TV event helped the film become the highest-rated premiere of any documentary in the network's history and earned its 3rd Peabody. ESPN Films continued in this author-driven format with Spike Lee's Kobe Doing Work. From its opening moments, the production announces its status as a product of Lee's creative vision. It begins, in fact, with the solitary filmmaker strutting onto the Lakers' home court to unveil his work. ESPN reinforced the production's position as Lee's handiwork by branding it as a Spike Lee joint, the title all of the filmmaker's productions carry. Similar to Black Magic, and in keeping with ESPN Films' creative aspirations, ESPN initially aired Kobe Doing Work with limited commercial interruption. "We wanted to make it a cinematic experience," Dahl remarks. "If you keep interrupting the flow of the story, it gets really hard to get into it." These presentations allowed ESPN Films to foster a mode of viewership comparable to HBO and PBS's presentations. Indeed, documentaries' lower production costs compared to scripted content made it easier to rationalize airing Black Magic and Kobe Doing Work with little or no commercial interruption. ESPN complemented the reduced commercials by removing the bottom line, a crawl of scores and updates that runs along the base of the screen during programs for airings of these documentaries. That's the bottom line there. And so you can see Kobe Doing Work. This is a grab from Kobe Doing Work. They removed the bottom line for all of the ESPN Films documentaries across the network. So even if I Hate Christian Laettner is playing on ESPNU, which is something that will happen because it's college themed, etc., they still take out the bottom line to create this sort of cinematic register of viewership, which is actually something I didn't notice until they pointed it out to me. While he acknowledges the benefits of including a bottom line in programming, namely its ability to dissuade viewers from changing the channel, Dahl observes that if you have the bottom line, you're splitting the audience's attention. For a film, you're trying to get someone engaged in the story. Omitting the bottom line, he suggests, retains audiences by fostering an immersive viewing experience. Not all ESPN productions were so deliberately packaged as cinematic events. Several of the subsidiary's early documentaries received little promotion and premiered sporadically across the network's channels. Though their initial airings all excluded the bottom line, they were otherwise undistinguished from ESPN's regular programming flows. We hadn't figured out a way to package and sell these to our audience, ESPN Films Vice President Connor Schell says of the subsidiary's initial productions. There wasn't really a strategy around them. ESPN Films focused its strategic dimensions with 30 for 30, a series of 30 documentaries made by 30 commissioned filmmakers to commemorate ESPN's 30th anniversary. Sorry, I feel like a pitch man whenever I read that. And I'm not a pitch man. ESPN marketed 30 for 30, which has since expanded into a permanent series and spawned offshoots attached to different properties as a collection of cinematic documentaries that bear the aesthetic imprint of their directors, a roster that includes Steve James, Barry Levinson, Barbara Koppel, and Albert Maysles. 30 for 30 is the brainchild of ESPN.com columnist come franchise multimedia celebrity Bill Simmons, who claims he came up with the idea while packing away his collection of old sports VHS tapes. He wondered how ESPN, with its enormous archive, could reasonably claim to be the worldwide leader in sports without consistently producing sports documentaries. Simmons believed a documentary series that featured recognizable filmmakers would both shine a light on ESPN's influence and compose an effective way to commemorate its 30th anniversary. We're not just going to say half-heartedly that we're making documentaries, Schell notes at 30 for 30's development. We're going to make them with the best documentary filmmakers in the world. And we're not going to make one of them and see how it goes. We're going to make 30 of them. We're going to make this feel as special as possible. Part of being special is being credible, and the way you become credible is to work with the best people out there. Moreover, 30 for 30 provided the coherence that ESPN Films' initial documentaries lacked. The brand united the series selections, however disparate their topics, and encouraged viewers to experience them as a collection. ESPN reinforced 30 for 30's seriality by initially programming its films in consistent weekly time slots. 30 for 30 built distinction in part by reinforcing documentary's reputation as an exceptionally nuanced TV genre. According to ESPN Films executive producer Keith Clinkscales, documentary filmmaking provides a layer of intimacy that you just can't get from the normal way sports are covered. ESPN emphasizes this attitude by using the phrase, "too dramatic not to be real," as 30 for 30's tagline. The series trailer stresses that 30 for 30 sheds new light on sports past. It features footage from various films in the series combined with soft piano music and a baritone voiceover that intones, "What if I told you?" followed by a statement that contrasts conventional wisdom. For instance, it showcases Muhammad Ali training while the narrator says, "What if I told you he wasn't the greatest?" The footage of Ali is taken from the recently deceased documentarian Albert Maysles' Muhammad and Larry, an examination of Ali's embarrassing 1980 loss to Larry Holmes during the twilight of his career. The trailer suggests that Maysles' documentary offers an uncommon take on an icon that is already the subject of many documentaries and biographies. 30 for 30 also insists on its contrast to the sports documentary genre's common straightforwardness. These wouldn't be typical documentaries with highlights and talking heads and a chronological theme, Simmons vowed when introducing the project. Simmons claims that 30 for 30 privileged imaginative approaches to provocative sports stories over ensuring that it covered the most popular events. If there was no fresh take on the OJ trial, the 1980 Olympic hockey team, Magic's HIV-driven retirement, or any other iconic story from that time, then screw it, he said. We're not going to assign those topics just to have them in the series. The emphasis ESPN Films places on 30 for 30's formal innovation is also driven by ESPN's effort to usurp HBO Sports' position as television's most prominent producer of sports documentaries. I was watching an old HBO Sports documentary, Simmons claims, and got mad that ESPN has this monopoly. I thought, we're a sports network and they're not, but it's always, oh, they have this new documentary. In a 30 for 30 podcast Simmons hosted during the series' initial run, he, Schell, and Dahl complained that HBO Sports documentaries' repetitive use of talking heads, archive footage, and voiceover narration by the actor Liev Schreiber has rendered the genre trite. 30 for 30's comparative adventurousness, Skipper asserted, strove to transform the series into, quote, the first stop for documentary filmmakers to tell great stories. Despite ESPN Films' stated ambitions, though, most 30 for 30 documentaries actually adopt HBO's market-tested and conservative template. Regardless, ESPN Films producers maintain that 30 for 30 breathes new life into the predictable genre while attracting viewers who otherwise may have minimal interest in it. To enhance its refinement and gain aesthetic ground on its traditionally more respectable competitor, ESPN Film surrounds its work with markers of prestige that HBO sports productions do not possess. For example, it positions 30 for 30 as a film series that provides cinematic viewing experiences even though its primary home is TV. Television scholar John Caldwell observes that TV outlets often perpetuate this attitude by evoking film technology and practices to distinguish content. Prior to each 30 for 30, the ESPN Films logo appears in front of a white background with the circular light of a film projector shining into it. In doing so, it explicitly links ESPN Films with cinema technologies and exhibition. And you can see the sprockets of the film strip. It's a medium that used to exist. The 30 for 30 logo, an animated film strip with 30 for 30 printed on it and a beam of projected light shining through its center, fashions a similarly cinematic identity for the series. The branded film strip moves vertically and is accompanied by the series trademark. And aside from this logo, ESPN uses a graphic of old-fashioned red movie paper tickets with 30 for 30 in the tagline, "Too dramatic not to be real," emblazoned on them. Like the ESPN Films documentaries that precede the series, few 30 for 30 productions actually use any film stock. Those that do, such as Muhammad and Larry, principally employ it only briefly in an archival and contextual capacity. Reinforcing 30 for 30 cinematic status, ESPN recruited a series of presenting and participating sponsors to allow the documentaries to debut with limited commercial interruption. Moreover, Dahl claims the commercial breaks that do occur are regulated so they do not take place at times that might disrupt a particularly poignant moment. So this is kind of the repression of the commercial ends that are sort of fueling typical TV with a kind of privileging of the narrative integrity of a documentary. ESPN also, of course, removes the bottom line for 30 for 30 airings across the network. Adding to the cinematic image it cultivates for 30 for 30, ESPN calls attention to the participation of renowned filmmakers and emphasizes the creative flexibility it affords them. Simmons called the series, quote, "the greatest collection of filmmakers ever assembled under the same umbrella" when it launched. In many cases, the films of the filmmakers assembled resemble works that made the directors famous. Steve James's No Crossovers focus on race and basketball resonates with his documentary Hoop Dreams, and Barbara Koppel's House of Steinbrenner, which considers George Steinbrenner's reign as the New York Yankees owner, centers on workers in ways that echo her Academy Award-winning film, Harlan County, USA. 30 for 30 emphasizes its participating filmmakers' uniqueness by integrating filmmaking original sequences into commercial breaks wherein the directors, framed in film strip graphics, explain their aesthetic philosophies and personal relationship to the subject matter they explored. The filmmaking original segments that aired with No Crossover include James explaining how the project enabled him to come to grips with his hometown's racism. The 30 for 30 website also stresses the filmmaker's artistry and intimate connection to their subject matter with in-depth biographies and personal statements. Simmons added to these author-driven discourses with his 30 for 30 podcast, which included several of the series' filmmakers discussing their creative process in the production of their film. And the commissioned filmmakers repeatedly praised ESPN's lack of intervention, comments that ESPN recirculates in its promotional materials. James claims that the beauty of the whole series is ESPN didn't want it to look like it was made by the same person. They wanted them to be documentaries with the individual visions of their makers. I've yet to feel that I've had to compromise my vision, adds Hawk, who has worked with ESPN Films repeatedly since Through the Fire. In fact, Hawk's rough cut of The Best That Never Was, his first contribution to 30 for 30 on the rise and fall of college football phenom Marcus Dupree, ran longer than the 50 minutes ESPN initially allotted him. Impressed by the film's potential, ESPN allowed him to expand his documentary into a 102-minute production. Similarly, Alex Gibney's Catching Hell, which examines scapegoating in sports, was slated for release as part of 30 for 30's initial run, but was delayed until 2011. Simmons claims that granting Gibney more time to complete the project was a no-brainer. Quote, "The fact that he was spending more time on something that was already great had us really excited. The scenarios and comments indicate that ESPN allows its artists to explore their inspiration in a form, through methods, and at a pace that suits their process. Gibney locates ESPN's willingness to let directors experiment as the main quality that distinguishes 30 for 30 from HBO or from other TV sports documentaries. They're saying do it in your style, he claims. It's exactly the opposite of what you'd expect from a branded cable network, which can be bristling to an independent filmmaker, where you become just a sausage maker. He maintains that ESPN Films established a format for difference within the uniform sports documentary genre that it cultivates by aligning with unique artists whom it urges to explore their creativity. HBO has their format, Gibney notes, but they're rigorously produced with exactly the same style. So you go into a zone, you say, okay, this is the HBO sports film zone. 30 for 30 is doing just the opposite. They're saying each one of these is going to be wildly different. As Gibney indicates, and similar to ESPN's dubious assertions that 30 for 30's films are distinct from HBO sports documentaries, the series' employment of different filmmakers and ESPN Films' willingness to let those artists work autonomously enriches a potentially vibrant TV genre that HBO Sports has made stale. In reality, however, ESPN Films very closely monitors selection of 30 for 30 topics and the film's creation. It assigns a production team to each film that provides filmmakers with supports and offers ESPN progress reports. 30 for 30's focus on commissioned filmmakers as documentary's principal creative force reflects practices that David Bordwell uses to characterize art film, a genre in which the author becomes the overriding intelligence organizing the film for our comprehension. Caldwell notes that TV industries adopt this practice by situating directors as authorial visionaries and deploying those powerful signifiers to position certain content as artful enough to, quote, cut through the televised clutter. 30 for 30's appeals to its directors and their creative freedom borrows from these film and TV industry practices to set ESPN Films apart from HBO Sports, which typically does not market its documentaries through their directors. ESPN further reinforces 30 for 30 Productions' exceptional status by submitting them to and exhibiting them at Tribeca and other film festivals. ESPN markets the film's DVDs by including the laurel wreath trademarks from the festivals to which they were selected. It also uses ESPN Films' involvement in the festival world to cast itself as a patron of independent film rather than a corporate media outlet blindly exploiting the genre's commercial and cultural value. For instance, in 2013, ESPN started awarding the Tribeca Institute ESPN Prize, a $30,000 grant for a sports film in progress. Shell insists that despite the strategic advantages of ESPN's involvement with Tribeca, the partnership is, quote, inherently about trying to support the arts. And Silver calls the co-sponsored festival, quote, the most altruistic thing ESPN has done. The New York Times' Mike Hale claimed that ESPN and Tribeca's alliance raised sports films to a new prominence. ESPN, Hale affirms, not only belongs in, but fortifies the elite artistic world Tribeca represents. I don't know any company, Shell says of his employer, that would make a commitment like this to independent cinema. Although ESPN Films productions are directed by filmmakers who cut their teeth in indie circles, they're far from independent. They are, after all, funded by one of the world's largest media conglomerates. However, ESPN uses its partnership with Tribeca and presence on the festival circuit to position 30 for 30 as part of the indie film world and to reap this association's benefits. Simmons and Shell steadfastly assert that 30 for 30 is a historical and creative endeavor unmotivated by ratings or revenues. Skipper even describes it as, quote, a gift to our viewers. Despite these ostensible motives, the documentaries were very deliberately scheduled to capitalize on and enhance ESPN's original programming. So, anybody watch, what was it, I Hate Christian Laettner? Anybody watch that? When was that programmed? Do you remember the day it was programmed? Oh yeah, you guys don't watch live TV, do you? That's right. The over 50 crowd. Does anybody know when it was programmed? Students? Yeah, it's Election Sunday, right? So they produced, and they've done that every year. They've had a documentary that's college themed, starting with the Fab Five, that's produced and unveiled on Selection Sunday. They do it with a college football themed documentary every time after the Heisman Trophy presentation is done, so on and so forth. Okay? They also routinely integrate ESPN archive content, a cost-effective measure that simultaneously positions ESPN as sports' authoritative voice by suggesting the history they document cannot be remembered without the media outlet. These practices suggest that while 30 for 30 may have been designed as a gift, it was certainly developed in part to save money, appeal to the audiences its different channels attract, lure new viewers, and bolster ESPN's branded authority. The makers and marketers of work, sociologist Pierre Bourdieu reminds, are advertisers in collusion, who each abide by the same law which demands the repression of direct manifestations of personal interest, at least in its overtly economic form. Accordingly, ESPN's disavowal of its product's commercial motives builds symbolic value that bolsters their economic potential. The Peabody Award and International Documentary Association Distinguished Continuing Series Prize that 30 for 30 earned after its initial run made it ESPN's most honored project since SportsCentury. Based on this success, ESPN opted to continue the series without its focus on the years between 1979 and 2009. Complementing 30 for 30's continuation and its documentaries used across ESPN's channels, ESPN Films developed spin-off series to fuel different properties and inflect them with cinematic sophistication. For instance, in 2011, it began SEC Story, an outgrowth of ESPN's partnership with the NCAA's Southeastern Conference that had aired primarily on ESPNU until the ESPN-operated SEC Network's August 2014 launch. 9 for 9 was a co-production of ESPN Films and the website ESPNW, and the 2014 series Soccer Stories was conceived to promote ABC and ESPN's World Cup coverage. Perhaps more prominently, 30 for 30's success enabled Simmons to leverage his rising celebrity to create the sports and popular culture website Grantland.com. Taking inspiration from magazines like GQ and mimicking the strategy by which 30 for 30 created a refined image, the website specializes in long-form journalism, boasts a roster of noteworthy writers and editors who established their renown in print, and is named after the canonical sports writer Grantland Rice. Grantland also publishes companion articles for ESPN Films documentaries, and in May 2012 it became the home of 30 for 30 Shorts, a series of streamed short documentaries. So amidst 30 for 30's critically acclaimed maiden voyage, ESPN produced and aired The Decision, a 1-hour, July 8, 2010 primetime special where an NBA free agent LeBron James announced his plan to leave the Cleveland Cavaliers to join the Miami Heat, to take, as he infamously put it, his talents to South Beach. The Decision was a coup for ESPN during the relatively slow summer months, but James would only give ESPN the rights to transform his decision into The Decision if the network consented to pay all production costs and donate all proceeds to the Boys and Girls Club of America. ESPN agreed, and The Decision became the network's second highest rated program of the year, dwarfing the viewer numbers that even 30 for 30's most popular titles achieved. Though a ratings success, The Decision was a critical nightmare. Commentators condemned its transformation of a brief announcement into an hour-long program as unnecessarily excessive and charged that the concessions ESPN made to secure James's cooperation, even though the money went to charity, evidenced the outlet's disregard for journalistic standards. Sports Illustrated's Richard Deitch called it the worst thing ESPN has ever put its name to, and the National Post's Bruce Arthur dubbed it the most crass, blind, tone-deaf, sycophantic, narcissistic, wretched hour in sports television history. Many of the critiques focused on The Decision's resemblance to a competition-based reality TV show like ABC's The Bachelor, wherein James dumped the Cavaliers for the Heat. Resonances that prompted the moody Pennsylvanian journalist Buzz Bissinger to rename ESPN BSPN, America's bullshit leader. Beyond noting The Decision's formal resemblance to reality TV, these critiques suggest it shared the genre's stereotypical mindlessness. Indeed, the overwhelmingly negative response that The Decision garnered echoed critical reception of ESPN Original Entertainment's programs. 30 for 30 was designed to be, and was received as, an antidote to the cultural decay that reality TV represents. In Shell's words, quote, "As reality TV was sinking to new lows, we came intellectual and smart."
Though 30 for 30's ratings did not come close to rivaling those the decision pulled in, its use of the documentary genre and presentation as uniquely artful enable ESPN to counter suggestions that it blindly chases ratings. In 2012, ESPN investigative reporters and brothers Mark Fainaru-Wada and Steve Fainaru set out to write a book on the National Football League's involvement in football's concussion crisis. Unambiguously titled League of Denial, the project exposes the NFL's efforts to suppress information that links the concussions football players regularly suffer to neurodegenerative disorders and to discredit research that has validated such links. Soon after the Fainarus began researching, the PBS series Frontline expressed interest in producing an accompanying documentary. ESPN approved a formal partnership between Frontline and Outside the Lines committed to supporting and publicizing League of Denial. The project seemed an ideal journalistic endeavor wherein two qualified outlets pooled their respective expertise to investigate a powerful organization that was abusing its influence. The partnership also neatly complemented ESPN's involvement in documentary and a strategic alliance with Tribeca. Dwayne Bray, the head of ESPN's investigative unit, called Frontline, quote, the gold standard of long-form investigative documentaries. We're not the public trust that PBS is, admitted John Skipper, who suggested Frontline's impeccable reputation would bring ESPN a new level of credibility. The partnership, of course, also allowed PBS, an organization mired in perpetual fundraising, to benefit from the traffic that ESPN's brand delivers. Just weeks before League of Denial's October 2013 premiere, ESPN abruptly removed its brand from the project and canceled its agreement with PBS. Skipper claimed Frontline's trailer for the documentary was sensational and did not consider ESPN's editorial input. Mystified by ESPN's decision, Frontline executive producer Rainey Aronson-Roth denied that PBS had complete control over the project and promised that Frontline would welcome ESPN's editorial thoughts. Skipper's implication that Frontline lacks editorial scruples contradicts his celebration of PBS as a public trust, and is pretty ironic coming from the media outlet responsible for the decision. The Peabody that League of Denial received in 2014 further complicates Skipper's claim that the documentary was over the top. It was not a good time for anyone who believed in journalism at ESPN, Fainaru-Wada told me. The New York Times reported that the National Football League pressured ESPN to dissociate from Frontline in its damning documentary, a charge the NFL and ESPN denied. To ESPN's credit, though, the Fainarus maintained that the media outlet's decision in no way impacted their reportage. The documentary was still permitted to caption them as ESPN employees, and ESPN has not shied away from covering the controversy since the documentary's release. The issue is about branding, not about journalism, Bray explained after ESPN ended the PBS partnership. Though ESPN has continued to examine the topic, the outlet's efforts to protect its brand restrict the precise form its reportage takes and how it is packaged. ESPN Senior Vice President Norby Williamson describes the League of Denial incident as, quote, a precedent situation where we did not want to co-brand with something that we did not have editorial control over. There are, however, many cases where ESPN proudly advertises its refusal of editorial control. It does not select which works are chosen for inclusion in the Tribeca ESPN Film Festival. Kobe Doing Work is a Spike Lee joint. And 30 for 30's documentaries are driven by filmmaking originals rather than ESPN. In each case, ESPN trumpets its lack of editorial governance to emphasize the undertaking's quality. When asked about this seeming inconsistency across ESPN's operation, news director, recently retired, Vince Doria, explained that ESPN Films documentaries concede editorial control because they're, quote, not investigative in nature. Contradictions emerge, however. Billy Corbin's 30 for 30 documentary Broke, for example, is based on and extends investigative reporter Pablo Torres' examination of the alarming number of professional athletes who go bankrupt soon after their careers end. Many other ESPN Films documentaries adopt the structure of investigative reports and are driven by interviews with filmmakers and reporters who have explored their themes and subjects. Doria's claims, then, like Skipper and Williamson's remarks, are dubious. Despite ESPN's assertions to the contrary, its decision to end its partnership with PBS was almost certainly an effort to protect its relationship with the National Football League, which it pays roughly $2 billion annually to protect its relationship, or for the rights to Monday Night Football. Several anonymous ESPN employees confirmed as much to the New York Times. While ESPN builds prestige through diverse alliances with respected organizations and individuals, it will not, it seems, allow these efforts to compromise its partnership with the United States' most powerful sports league. With League of Denial, then, ESPN sacrificed a fifth Peabody to kowtow to its most valuable client. Though very protective of it, ESPN continues to spread its brand as far as it will stretch, and sometimes farther. It currently owns 24 networks outside of the US, and its TV programming is available in 61 countries. In 2008, for example, ESPN purchased the cricket website crickinfo.com and the rugby site scrum.com, both of which principally attract fans outside of the United States. ESPN pairs its global expansion with a steady infiltration of regional markets. Its SEC network hired Alabama sports talk radio icon Paul Feinbaum as a football commentator. ESPN thus works to create a state of affairs where Sri Lankan cricket fans and University of Alabama football supporters alike will get their sports news from ESPN. ESPN fortifies its imperial project by exploiting the deregulated U.S. cable and TV industry's amenability to corporate interests. According to the financial information firm SNL Kagan, ESPN charged an average of $6.04 per subscriber in 2014. Cable's next most costly channel, TNT, demanded $1.48. I have a very simple rule of how you establish value, Skipper gloats. It's whatever anyone will pay. Skipper's philosophy, it's pretty simple. Skipper's philosophy is aided by Disney lobbyists pressuring Congress to ensure that media conglomerates can sell cable channels in bundles, a practice that allows them to leverage their most popular channels in order to carry the less popular channels. ESPN is a virtual monopoly, claimed Charter Communications co-founder Jerry Kent. Backed up by Disney, it has a gun to the heads of cable operators. Sports TV, particularly live event coverage, has remained profitable amid industrial and technological changes that see consumers increasingly augmenting their cable television consumption with online content, and in some cases even cutting the cord in favor of subscription streaming practices. These shifts, which ESPN exploits with its streaming service Watch ESPN and its recent partnership with the internet TV service Sling, have broadened ESPN's influence well beyond the context of sports media. There really is, there's no other media entity that pulls it in like ESPN does. ESPN's steady expansion and fee increases would be impossible, of course, without its recognizable brand. Brands, reminds Sarah Benet Weiser, are about culture as much as they are about economics. They compose symbols through which everyday life is lived that transmit social and economic value. From the clothing it licenses to its decision to separate from League of Denial, ESPN molds the meanings it names signals and monitors where it roams. It creates and maintains a framework through which sport is experienced and interpreted, a culture that suggests sports' existence and meanings are inseparable from and impossible without ESPN. Now, many critics have complained that the culture ESPN fashions is a degraded one, wherein the content it produces is always secondary to its bottom line. While such critiques certainly have merit, there's still a lot to praise about ESPN. Implementations like ESPN in Films and Grantland, for instance, institute sports media as a major player in the contemporary culture industries, not merely a repository for event coverage, highlights, and updates. Cultural value is built through what Bourdieu calls a social alchemy of symbolically potent traditions, institutions, and gatekeepers. ESPN situates itself as a site of cultural production by associating with, exploiting, and in some cases co-opting these powerful signifiers. Beyond inflecting ESPN with authority and authenticity, these activities position it as its brand as a recognizable symbol, like Apple or Harley Davidson or Nike, that sports fans employ to distinguish themselves. Like Bourdieu claims of art, ESPN's varied efforts to build distinction are relatively high in symbolic capital and low in economic capital. With few exceptions, the revenues ESPN's documentaries and other strategically classy properties generate pale in comparison to its live event coverage and popular studio programs. But these comparatively highbrow productions deliberately offset programs like the stage debate show First Take's comparative shallowness. Williamson describes the scope of ESPN's content as a pendulum that strategically oscillates between the poles of sophistication and superficiality. Programs like First Take attract large audiences of mostly young men, while ESPN films documentaries assure smaller, but slightly broader and typically wealthier audiences that ESPN is not driven by the lowest common denominator. We're ubiquitous, John Skipper told me, and there's a tendency in culture to think of big as bad. The big bad Coca-Cola company, big bad Nike. Part of what we're trying to do is provide people with surprise and delight from places where they don't expect to see ESPN. So it becomes harder to say big bad ESPN. Sometimes we get tired. They're everywhere. They drive me crazy. When someone like that sees a 30 for 30, it forces them to stop and go, wow, my thinking of ESPN as a soulless corporate entity is pretty hard to do when I watch a really smart, sensitive, nuanced examination of something. But more than simply appeasing those customers with more refined sports media palettes, ESPN's diverse efforts to build prestige suggest the organization governs sports meanings, uses, and potential. These sometimes surprising activities have helped ESPN to produce a sports media landscape with more content than ever before, but they've also aided the company's efforts to claim this environment as its kingdom and to limit the presence of alternatives that might question or contest its reign. They make ESPN's carefully orchestrated and vigilantly guarded status as the worldwide leader in sports seem a natural fact, and filter all of the content it produces through this cultural and industrial common sense. This is precisely why it is so vital to critique and contextualize this branded culture, however artful its products might be, and to point out the motives that guide its construction and maintenance. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Questions?
Questions?
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how certain ESPN employees or content producers conceive of themselves within this ecosystem. So I'm thinking in particular of Bill Simmons getting suspended recently for sort of talking about the Ray Rice investigation, or how other people conceive of themselves in this ecosystem or diverse soulless corporation, or however they think of themselves.
Sure. And just to be clear, I don't think you were implying this, but I don't think that ESPN is necessarily a soulless corporation. But I do think it's really important to understand the motives that guide its practices. Right? It's so ubiquitous. It is truly a framework through which most people experience and consume sports. So it's important to figure out the mechanisms that are driving that. As far as Simmons goes, Simmons is a bit exceptional. He's kind of got some freedom that some of the other folks in ESPN don't have. And in a way, his one journalist described kind of the pot shots he takes at ESPN as analogous to David Letterman kind of, hassling CBS, right? They both kind of benefit from it. ESPN sort of does the whack-a-mole on Simmons for a couple of weeks, and Simmons gets that cred, right? That sort of everyman, vox populi kind of cred of being the person who's not afraid to speak his mind. And I think in some ways what Simmons is saying is obviously very poignant and useful and smart. Now other kinds of ESPN employees, I think they kind of manage that balance between cultivating their individual brand as celebrities or as commentators or as journalists or whatever they're saying they are, and appeasing ESPN. So you can think of folks like Mike and Mike, Dick Vitale, right, who's basically like he's kind of become, I guess like a mascot or something like that, maybe, etc. So I think that the Simmons case is actually the most interesting one because he probably has the most flexibility of all those folks. And some people told me when I was doing interviews for the book that Simmons has the most power in ESPN after John Skipper, and maybe even more, because his brand is so strong, right? And he's leveraged himself into all these different properties And I think it's important to give Simmons some credit too, because, you know, he started his sports guy thing, and, you know, he's really become this kind of franchise voice. He did those books, he started 30 for 30, was behind Hamlin, etc. He's very enterprising and creative and interesting person. I don't always like what he writes, but I think he's interesting. Does that answer your question?
If you do the math on the per subscriber fees that ESPN gets, you get about $7 billion a year. And if you look at Fox Sports, they're probably about $1 billion. And Fox Sports is really the only sports network that has come out and said, we want to take on ESPN, we want to compete with ESPN. Do you think that there is some time in the future, either through Fox Sports or somebody else, how can anybody create some competition for ESPN with that difference in the $7 billion versus $1 billion? I mean, they have the ability to go out and get all the rights, just about, this is what they've done. They got all the rights and they got them tied up for 10 years or more. So how does anybody compete with ESPN? Do you think it's possible? Do you think Fox Sports can possibly compete with them?
About how someone might get some kind of market share in a market that seems so saturated by ESPN, and to look at ESPN being so, I guess, proactive or aggressive in trying to infiltrate markets that are established, but also markets that are emerging. For instance, this idea of streaming content or the convergence between ESPN Films and Grantland, etc. One of the things that, as I understand it, Fox Sports was trying to do was trying to kind of predict certain niches that might emerge as more viable down the road. So things like what makes martial arts and those kinds of things. NBC is now turning toward boxing and trying to revitalize that, etc. So it seems like the strategy that a lot of these folks are using is trying to, you know, establish a niche, just like ESPN did in the early 80s and late 70s, as being the niche of this 24-hour thing where you can watch water polo at 2 o'clock in the morning when you can't sleep. Trying to gain some kind of identification with the MLS, or I guess ESPN does own the MLS, so that's a bad example, UFC or boxing, etc., and trying to kind of build from that. But it was interesting when Fox Sports emerged. ESPN did all this stuff within the span of a couple of weeks. They hired Olbermann back. They bought Nate Silver's website. They didn't just hire Nate Silver and host his website like the New York Times did. They did the Times one better and bought the website. They also hired Jason Whitlock back, who had previously worked for them, and promised him that they were going to create what he was describing as a black Grantland for ESPN. So you can see when something that's another kind of whack-a-mole example, when something like that emerges, ESPN, you know, fans out in all these different directions to try to gain some kind of edge on this emerging competitor, whether or not they're a legitimate threat. But yeah, it would certainly be an uphill battle.
European soccer is another thing.
Sure, yeah, absolutely, absolutely, yeah. But you can see how they're looking at the market and they're finding places where ESPN is not, and they're trying to sort of start from that point. That's at least, yeah. Matt? Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
I was going to just real quick, given the reliance and the complete domination of ESPN on cable, do you think ESPN is somewhat invested in the cable system continuing, or whether or not they're going to, in other words, are they going to try and limit the availability of stuff online so as to keep people from cutting the cord?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think my question, or my answer would probably be, as I understand it, both. You know, they recognize that people more and more are going to start getting their material and expect their material to be online regardless. For instance, ESPN just last week or a week or two ago just redesigned their website. And the whole reason they redesigned it was for it to be conducive to tablet use, right? And if you look on the website, it looks different, but it's very good for sort of the more immersive, interactive kind of tablet use. So I would say both. I mean, Disney has lobbyists in Washington trying to ensure the continuation of bundling. At the same time, they're partnering with Sling, right? Things that seem a little bit opposed in certain ways But again, it's this example, another example of them trying to, you know, get their tentacles in every potential revenue stream and to try to predict these things. And, you know, if Sling doesn't work out, they'll sort of, for lack of a better term, pull the plug on it and do something else. But they'll at least be, I guess, out in front of it. That was one of the things that they kept saying to me when I was talking to them, was staying out in front of things. And they have the resources to do the kind of R&D to burn those monies when they don't work out. Sorry about that.
No, no problem. Thank you so much. I had a question about, you know, the joke that you made at the beginning about how they were thinking of ESPN as probably causing several divorces, and I wonder how ESPN as a culture and it being ubiquitous, what it means when women are almost absent completely from this culture that we're talking about, and where you see it going, especially when they want to stay ahead of things.
It means a lot. In terms of, I mean, if ESPN for you mass comm folks is an agenda setter, and you see where the women are or aren't in ESPN, that says a heck of a lot about mainstream sports media. I was just talking to the folks at lunch today about one of my favorite examples when I'm teaching gender in sports media, to talk about marginality, or the kind of marginalization of women pushed out of kind of the spotlight and into the margins, right? A metaphor that we use from paper. And I would pull up ESPN.com and say, okay, where's the link to ESPNW, which is ESPN's women-oriented website? And it was literally in the bottom right corner, literally in the margins. Now they've done things like ESPN 9 for 9, the female-oriented film series, but that premiered in August or July, right? The slowest part of the TV schedule. They weren't on during prime time like the 30 for 30s were. They didn't get the kind of promotion that 30 for 30 did. And then you ask yourself, okay, well, we have this entire series devoted to women, right? That's great, right? Women filmmakers, we like that, we'll get behind that. But how many 30 for 30s are directed by women? I think there were 2 or 3 maybe. There have been over 100, I think, or close to 100, right? So when we start kind of contextualizing that, we can see the sort of bones that they throw to women here and there. And they, you know, they do some interesting things. I mean, their coverage of the NCAA women's basketball tournament, which we were talking about at lunch, was fine. But when you kind of contextualize it and compare it to the men's coverage in certain settings, it's negligible at best. Kevin?
Yeah, Travis, thank you so much for coming to Penn State and sharing your work with us. This is, I guess, kind of an observation. It seems to me that when you talk about ESPN's using this kind of commodified, you know, cinematic auteurism as a way, a kind of lost leader to build a high end to the brand, and the way it explicitly claims, you know, independence from the ESPN octopus. It seems in line with what a lot of corporations, a lot of huge multinationals are doing, like where major beer brands are inventing these faux craft labels, where Kraft, for instance, is marketing kind of fake or artisanal cheese brands, where there's corporations themselves are monetizing either passive or active anti-corporate sentiment. And I wondered if you would, you know, I mean, did anybody at ESPN see any irony in this at all, or is it like Bill Hicks says they're going after that anti-marketing dollar?
Yeah. Well, I think that Bill Hicks would be accurate in this instance. But they, you know, I think they do see the irony, but they also see the effectiveness, right? These are folks who are, you know, I mean, just as you saw that quote, I mean, Skipper, their president, was not bashful about admitting that to me. He did not feel bad about that. He just was, well, yeah, that's what we do. It makes sense to do that. Now, as far as the sort of loss leader stuff that they're doing, yeah, sure, that's, I mean, think of another Disney, or think of Miramax, for instance, or something along those lines. And actually, somebody at ESPN described Grantland, Bill Simmons' website, as sort of ESPN's Miramax, right? This sort of boutique production company that they're able to create some sort of symbolic distance from the more overtly revenue-generating operations. It doesn't have the presence of advertising like ESPN ESPN.com does, or it has a different kind of presence of advertising. It'll be sponsored by different types of advertisers, etc. Another example, I mean, in popular culture and sports media is those new LeBron James commercials for Kia, right? They have LeBron James, driving kind of the luxury Kia, and then you see the Blake Griffin commercial, and he's driving the sort of regular Kia, I guess. But it's definitely not exclusive to sports media. One of the things that's interesting, though, to me is to locate ESPN within a tradition of kind of media culture, and to see how something as sort of everyday as ESPN, right, can employ signifiers of classical Hollywood cinema and film technology and auteurism, and even kind of evoke some of these traditions in ways that kind of link it to those traditions, when really there's not too much that they have in common with them. Yes, sir?
Where does the magazine fit into this picture?
ESPN, the magazine's an interesting case. It started in 1998, and really what it was trying to do initially was to create a kind of TV-inspired magazine, in contrast to Sports Illustrated's more long-form, less immediate kind of orientation, right? And so what they started doing was doing these things like having the Sports Center anchors kind of doing features, et cetera, and really mimicking television. But a couple of years after ESPN, the magazine, emerged, they created Page 2 on ESPN.com as kind of a complement to that. And that was sort of where they tried to get the more niche audiences that we can trace to things like 30 for 30 and Grantland. For instance, for Page 2, they hired Ralph Wiley and Hunter S. Thompson. Some really weird columns by Hunter S. Thompson. They were kind of fun to read if you get a chance. David Halberstam, and that's sort of where Simmons came into play. And so in a way, the magazine was their foray into print, right? A medium that's traditionally connoted as more sophisticated or refined than television, but they were using print in a way that was inspired by TV in order to gain some kind of market share on Sports Illustrated, which at the time and still is kind of the highest circulating sports magazine. ESPN, the magazine, is still #2. But they moved online with Page 2 for some of that more kind of thoughtful, prestige kind of journalism with the Hunter Thompson columns and the Halberstam columns and the Wiley stuff. But really, check out some of those Hunter S. Thompson columns on ESPN.com, Page 2, when you get a chance. It's pretty interesting stuff. Yeah?
Did you see any impact or influence on ESPN or response by ESPN due to websites such as Deadspin that have sold themselves as the counterculture to ESPN culture? They're not actually, the anti-ESPN like they said they are?
Sure. Well, it's interesting because Deadspin emerged, like you said, they call it sports news without access, favor, or discretion. And they kind of serve as a sort of watchdog, or they fancy themselves as serving as a kind of watchdog, in between those GIFs of people getting hit in the crotch with soccer balls or whatever, are some things that are actually taking ESPN to task in a way that watchdog news organizations do. And ESPN is very sensitive to Deadspin and keeps a real kind of close eye on them, but they've also infiltrated a lot of the folks at Deadspin. Katie Baker, for instance, who's at Grantland, used to write for Deadspin. They tried to hire Tommy Craigs until Craigs, he's an interesting guy, until he kind of self-sabotaged the whole endeavor. Craig's now runs Gawker, so he's doing just fine. But they've both kind of warded off Deadspin and tried to basically deny its credibility as a news outlet, right? Because Deadspin wasn't looking for credentials or anything like that, and in fact actively kind of avoided the search or the effort to get credentials. But also they've kind of infiltrated Deadspin in a lot of ways too, to try to get their most talented and their most popular writers. And this started a long time actually ago. There was this website, I don't know if anybody might remember, it's called Sports Jones. Anybody remember that website? Started in '98, actually by a University of Iowa graduate student in communication studies named Royce Webb. started doing pretty well. They had Dick Rapeau was writing a piece for them every now and again, if anybody knows Professor Rapeau. And they gained some traction. They were doing book reviews and kind of doing this more high-minded sort of stuff, almost like a slate, or he described it, Royce Webb described it to me as like a Mother Jones approach to sports journalism. And they did pretty well, right? And ESPN eventually gobbled them up, right? And they essentially just assigned these Sports Jones people to different facets of ESPN. They sort of did some of the stuff that they were becoming noteworthy for Sports Jones. But more so than utilizing these new resources, ESPN just kind of eliminated them, and eliminated, along with eliminating them, eliminating their perspective and any potential dissent. Royce still writes really good basketball stuff for ESPN, but he's not doing the kind of stuff that he was doing on Sports Jones. And all that kind of got eclipsed by the Bill Simmons wave of that cult of personality that kind of happened shortly after they hired the Sports Jones guys. I think Deadspin might be a similar example, but of course they haven't purchased Deadspin, and I don't think they will. That's a good question, though. Thanks a lot for that one.
Thank you for being here. Without trying to, I'm not trying to put you on the spot or anything,
Go for it.
but no, I feel the need to ask just since you're here, and it was such a massive story and really an ESPN flagship program, SportsCenter. I mean, it wouldn't stop for, it seemed like a year almost. I was wondering how you would grade ESPN's coverage of the Penn State scandal from 2011.
Their coverage of the story. I don't know if I feel comfortable grading it necessarily. I mean, one thing that I was talking about with a couple of people that I heard that folks in State College appreciated was that ESPN carried through with the story, whereas the CNN folks were here for a couple of weeks and then split, and the national outlets kind of were here for a couple of weeks and then split. And so in that regard, it seems like people here seem to think that they had a degree of responsibility. To be honest, when I was reading about the situation here, I wasn't really looking so much to ESPN for it. And that might be my own mistake, but I was looking to other kinds of news outlets for it and reading, columns on it and etc. I didn't personally really concern myself too directly with what ESPN was saying about it. I read a couple of things by Michael Weinreb that I thought were really good. He's a smart guy. Charlie Pierce did a couple of really great things. I mean, I think he's one of the best sports writers in the world. But as far as the day-to-day coverage, I was getting my news from other outlets. That's not to say that I don't consume ESPN. I check that website as much as I check any others. But I don't really feel comfortable grading their performance on it. That's not really what I'm about. It's like grading the effectiveness of media coverage. But I wasn't disappointed.
Thank you.
That's a good question. Yeah.
Based on your own research or things you've heard from other people, do you get the sense that ESPN executives feel that some of the more thoughtful programming, like the 30 for 30s and the outside the lines, justifies some of the lowest common denominator, the first take, Olbermann, et cetera, or do they feel like they don't have to justify that at all because they're ESPN and the ratings keep coming in?
Well, I think that they would first say that the ratings sort of speak for themselves, right? That they're in the business, they're in the entertainment business, they're in the business of selling advertising, they're in the business of selling sponsors. So you can say like, Kmart presents the top 10 plays or whatever. But Norby Williamson, one of their producers, did describe it as kind of a pendulum, where the lower brow or the higher brow stuff kind of offsets the lower brow stuff. And then John Skipper, their president, mentioned that they do this strategically, and it operates as what Kevin used the term loss leader a minute ago, as a way to kind of say, when you're critiqued, okay, well, maybe you don't like that we're doing this stage debate, or that we talk about Tim Tebow every 2 seconds, or that First Take spent a half an hour today talking about Johnny Manziel getting out of rehab, or an extra 20 minutes about whether Jordan Spieth is the new Tiger Woods or whatever, just stuff that's pretty much meaningless and silly. That they can use stuff like Randall and stuff like 30 for 30, stuff like Sports Century, stuff like the Hunter S. Thompson columns or the Halberstam columns, etc., to say, hey, well, yeah, sure, we got to make money, but we also do this stuff, and we don't even make that much money off of it, right? Aren't we great? And so that is very much a strategic kind of thing, and that's kind of how loss leader works in the TV industry, generally speaking, in a lot of ways. At least loss leader that's kind of premised on prestige, right? So television networks would do a lot with their news outlets, which would sort of traditionally lose money, but it was providing this kind of public service and giving the entire network a degree of credibility that it could use to ward off any potential criticisms that might arise. That's a good question, thanks.
Maybe one more question? I have one then. Anybody else doesn't? How did ESPN, the folks at ESPN understand playmakers? Or what were the lessons learned from playmakers for them?
Playmakers was an ESPN original entertainment scripted drama that was, gosh, when was it? Was it 2006? I want to say 2006. Maybe it was a little after that. Anyway, it was a very salacious sort of soap opera-like drama that took as its subject a fictional professional football league and this team called the Cougars. And there was a quarterback who was addicted to painkillers, there was a wide receiver who was gay, there was a running back who was like freebasing in the locker room, there was somebody who had permanently injured another player and was suffering from depression, and the coach had cancer but he didn't want to tell anybody. It was just a real soap opera. And people loved it. I remember watching it, I thought it was really entertaining. Really kind of silly, but totally entertaining. And it was advertising. This was at the time when ESPN had Sunday Night Football. It was before, so it must have been 2006, yeah. So ESPN was advertising for playmakers during Sunday Night Football. Tune in next Tuesday when we see if so-and-so lives or dies or whatever. And the NFL got pissed because even though it wasn't representing National Football League, it was clearly evoking the NFL by representing this professional football league, and also by kind of, sort of ripping from the headlines in kind of the Law and Order style, where you would have, for instance, a storyline on spousal abuse not long after kind of a storyline on spousal abuse in the MLB or whatever. And so the NFL took issue with this, and ESPN decided, even though it was very successful, that they were going to remove it, or they were going to cancel it after one season. And they didn't deny that it was because of the NFL. They admitted that it was because of the NFL, but they basically just said, we're not in the business of irritating or upsetting our sponsors. We didn't want to rub the NFL's face in this program, and so they just took it off the air, and it never came back. But if you have a chance to check it out, you can buy it for like a penny on Amazon the first season. It's really bizarre and interesting. But that was a sort of a precursor, obviously, to the League of Denial situation, which is a lot more sticky, though, because they're talking about an actual investigative project. It's one thing to can a scripted series, that's about a series or a team of sort of wild football players. It's quite another thing to can an investigative documentary that's looking into sort of rampant irresponsibility in a really prominent organization. So you can see how there's kind of a difference between those two cases, but obviously a connection. Thanks. That's good.
All right, well, please join me in thanking Dr. Vogan.